Alright, first up we'll do something I haven't yet done in Lost Bits, and that's to take a look at some unused audio that was left out from the final release of the game and share it with you guys. Firstly, there is a remix of the Animal Friends theme as heard in Kirby's Dream Land 3. Next, there's a cut version of Kirby's classic Victory Dance theme that actually doesn't appear in the game. And also an unused shorter version of the same song. The last unused audio clip is pretty weird. Here, have a listen. Apparently this is a sped up reading of the first two lines of a traditional Japanese poem called Iroha. Iroha is basically somewhat of a Japanese equivalent to the English ABC song, as in its entirety it contains each character of the Japanese syllabary no more than once. Alright, time to go full weeb here. So the first two lines from the poem go as follows. I hope I get this right. Iro wa ni oedo, chiri nuru o. For those of you interested, it roughly translates to, even the blossoming flowers will eventually scatter. That's actually quite a deep start to a poem. It's basically saying even the nicest things in life will eventually die. I could see why this wasn't included in the final game, about a cute pink puffball, but what its original intended use was, your guess is as good as mine. Now let's have a look at an unused graphic that can be found in the game's files. This early art appears to show many of the characters we know, early designs of some of the new characters, as well as Kirby's animal friends, which only made a brief appearance in the final game. The numbers under Kirby 64 are likely the date when this art was finished, on October 30th, 1998, about a year and a half before the game's final Japanese release date. Yeah, I know for many of us that's a weird order to write the date, as we in North America typically use month, day, year. Some people have also linked this artwork to a pre-release screenshot of the game, which features similar art in the character profile portraits. This has also led some to speculate that it is possible that Kirby's animal friends were initially meant to play a bigger role in the game instead of just appearing as Kirby's stone transformation. It's that special time of Lost Bits again, unused test room time. Surprisingly enough, Kirby 64 has a total of 7 unused test rooms for us to explore. First up is a map internally named Abe 100. This map is a straight path with all the different kinds of terrain seen in the game. Each different material is also labeled in Japanese. The terrains include ice, snow, sand, wood, cloud, grass, iron, and slippery. It is obvious that this map was used to test Kirby's movement and traction on various terrains. Next is Abe 200, and this is probably the most basic test room that I've ever seen. It's just a closed off room with Adeline, who draws and gives you a 1-up. Yep, that's it. Wait a second, scratch that. Actually, the next room, Enna Test 1, is the most basic room that I have ever seen. I don't know why this test room was left over, but it's seriously just nothing, and Kirby just falls forever. However, as the name of the map implies, maybe at some point in the game's development, the room had a much different role in that of testing enemies, maybe? The next room, Enna Test 2, although more than just nothing, this room doesn't offer much more. It is just a large room with a weirdly colored grid-like background. This room is empty, but again, as the name implies, maybe at some point it was used to test enemies. Break Test 1, as you can see, is for some strange reason overlaid with some weird cloud effect, and it's fairly obstructive. Maybe this was some sort of test for a background effect or for something for the heads-up display, but honestly I have no idea. At least this empty map has some obstacles to jump on. Yes, finally a test room with things. Item 01 is kind of similar to the map with the different terrains, but this time it's a map that features various items in the game instead. Various recovery foods, stars, and invincibility candies all make an appearance in this map a few times. There's also a body of water and some platforms later in the map, but oddly enough, neither of them have any collision detection with Kirby. Although still pretty bare bones, this test map, at least compared to the others, appears to be the closest to the final version of the game. And lastly, I don't know if this counts as a test map really, but we can also access the How to Play demo screen, which normally gives players a first-time overview on how to play the game, which is normally not playable. It appears just as it does in the demonstration, but this time we can have full control. Alright, now let's try moving the camera around and see if we can see some cool unseen Yeah, I don't know what it is, but I have some of the worst experiences with these programs. Apparently if I try to pull the camera too far back, some weird funky stuff starts happening. But anyway, although there isn't all too much that I was able to find that isn't too out of the ordinary, it was still pretty cool to have a closer look at some of the objects or to see them at a different angle. Although Kirby walks on a pretty linear path throughout the game, it is pretty cool to see that basically everything in the background is fully modeled. The first interesting thing that I was able to look at was this big castle. Unsurprisingly enough, if we take a closer look at the castle, we can see that much of it is untextured. Even at the section that you enter the castle, we can see that the developers only textured as much as they needed to, so good job developers. When leaving the castle later in the level, I wanted to check if the path from the start of the level was still there, but it looks like it wasn't. Just an aside really quick, it's really interesting to play this game from some different angles. I mean, who doesn't want to see a really big close-up of Wispy Woods? Next up, I wanted to take a look at this moving screen area in which sand is constantly rising. At the top of the room, we can see that Waddle Dee's model appears before he actually comes on screen, and he actually just hangs out for a few seconds before popping in to rescue Kirby. He then apparently just goes right back to hanging upside down off screen and just chills there. Also, by moving the camera back, we can see that the sand wasn't actually rising, and that the effect was an illusion created by the developers by simply overlaying a small sandy square layer, which isn't fully seeable by the player. Doesn't look so menacing from this angle, does it? When exiting this room, I noticed these mirage-looking pyramids in the stage's background, so I decided to take a closer look. It appeared as if they got clearer as I got closer, but they were still very translucent. And the last cool thing I want to talk about in this video is this weird polygonal pyramid UFO thing that emerges from the sand. As you can see, it appears that the pyramid is still completely textured underground before it actually emerges. And we can also move in to have a closer look at the inside of the UFO before we actually jump in. Alright, let's start this video with something big. Turns out there are sprites left over in the game for a scrapped mini Kirby ability. Similar to Mario getting a mini mushroom, this ability would allow the pink puffball to enter small crevices and such to get to hidden areas. This ability was actually reintroduced 12 years later after the release of Kirby's Adventure in Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. Another interesting tidbit is that due to where the graphics are located in the game's sprite banks, it is believed that UFO Kirby had actually replaced the mini ability. In addition to the mini ability, there are actually about 15 more cut abilities. According to Satoru Iwata, who at the time was a producer for the game, originally the game had over 40 enemy copy abilities, but the best were selected and this number in the final game was reduced to about 25. Masahiro Sakurai and Mr. Iwata have also gone on record to mention that some of the scrapped abilities included one in which Kirby could create blocks, one that would allow Kirby to ride a rocket, and one that would allow him to turn into an animal that would scratch and bite enemies. The latter two eventually did get used in future Kirby games as the rocket and animal abilities. Next up, let's move along to some of the game's unused graphics. When I was younger, I really liked seeing all the different pixel art icons for each of Kirby's abilities, and it looks like there are some icons that are left over or unused. The first of these is an unseen, untranslated Japanese invincibility icon that is for some reason still left over in the North American version of the game. The other icon is technically seen in the game, but it is unused for its intended purpose. The cannon icon was supposed to be used, obviously, when Kirby would get into a cannon. And although it goes unused, like I mentioned, it can actually be seen in the game for a split second when all of the different abilities flash during the roulette section of a random ability after Kirby inhales at least 2 of his enemies. Next are some water tiles that go unused. In the game's files, 7 different water tiles can be found, however only 2 of them are actually used, and these are the rest that go unused. Here's what they would have looked like had they been animated and used in the game. In addition to these water tiles, there are some more unused tile sets. This set would be used in a sort of dark room that would change if Kirby used the light ability. A mock-up of this has been created to show how this tile set might have been used after an area had been lit up to reveal more of its features. And the last unused tile set is for what appears to be an early Level Hub heads-up display. By the looks of things, it was originally going to be much darker than what was used in the final game, and it looks like some of the graphics, like the Kirby icon, were also altered. And speaking of the level hub areas, there is also an unused stage door sign graphic for a 7th level. In the final game, the area with the most levels only has 6 stages, leaving this sign unnecessary, resulting in it being unused. Oddly enough, by playing around with the game's memory, this sign graphic can actually replace some of the enemies' animations. Pretty weird. In addition to the normal levels, Kirby's Adventure also has a few mini-games in which you can win some extra lives. One of these is the Crane game, which too has some unused graphics. Among the graphics for it, there exists a sprite for having 3 credits in the game. In the actual game, however, the most we can get is 2. But again, by messing around with the game's memory, this sprite and having 3 goes at the Crane game can actually be loaded into the game. Alright you guys, it's been a while since we've seen some cool unused test areas here on Lost Bits, but thankfully Kirby's Adventure has a ton for us to explore. Turns out there is an unseen area just at the start of the game on the 2nd level. Normally when playing, when we get to this star, the game won't let us continue any further. But by doing some simple glitching, you can cause the star to not appear, and this lets us move further down to reveal giant letters spelling out HAL, the developers of the game. Since this game, these HAL rooms have appeared in a number of Kirby games. For some reason, there's also a lone broom hatter just chilling on the L. Alright, and now we move on to some scrapped areas. Starting them off, we have 2 unused level hub-like areas. The first one appears to have been a multi-world hub area which would have served as a shortcut to other stages. Each door will take Kirby to the hub area of a different level. The top 4 doors go to levels 1 through 4 from left to right, and then the bottom 3 doors lead to levels 5 through 7. The last bottom right door doesn't do anything, so my guess is maybe at one point the game was supposed to have another entire level. This room does look pretty complete, so I'm not really sure why they would have removed this hub area as a shortcut to other levels in favor of the system in the final game in which Kirby can only move between levels one at a time. The next hub-like area definitely looks less complete compared to the previous one. In this room, the top left door leads back to the previously mentioned hub area, and the 5 bottom doors lead to some other testing rooms, which we will get back to later. Again, just like in the last room, the last 2 doors don't have any sort of function. And another little tidbit for the fellow geeks out there, although at first the ladder pieces appear to be random and pointless, they are in fact representations of binary numbers above each door, numbering them 1 to 7. The next area we can access is the room from the game's tutorial. So I guess it is used, but you normally can't actually play in it, so it's still pretty slick. Next up are 4 unused rooms with some scattered backgrounds, each with a mini-boss to fight. However, the Bugsy, Mr. TikTok, Rolling Turtle, and Poppy Brothers Sr. mini-boss versions here are faster and more difficult compared to those normally seen anywhere in the game. The next set of unused rooms are pretty interesting as they are early layouts that were used to test the Meta Knight fight rooms that were seen in the final build of the game. As you can see from these screenshot comparisons, these layouts are pretty much identical, just the aesthetics were completely revamped. I just think it's so cool that we can still access these early development versions of these rooms. In addition to the Meta Knight fights that were used, there are also 3 more layouts for what I'm assuming are layouts for areas to fight Meta Knight in which were scrapped for one reason or another. Moving along, we can also access some unused and seemingly unfinished museum rooms. These are the rooms in the game in which you basically just go to if you want to get a certain copy ability. The first museum room is home to a single Chili enemy. One thing that you'll notice about all of these rooms is that the portraits behind the enemies are still left blank. The other unused museum rooms include one for Chili and Pengy, one for Twister, and one for both Rocky and Sparky. The last unused museum is the weirdest though. It is identical to the first I mentioned for the Chili enemy, but this one has a Sir Kibble enemy in it. But it's no ordinary Sir Kibble, as although it might look like him, it is actually a Togezo, the enemy that gives Kirby the Needle ability. And he also spawns in the wrong place too. Just all sorts of weird with this room. Next up is a pretty cool unused cannon puzzle. To get it right, you have to hit the stake near the cannon, quickly get the laser ability, and then time a shot so you can deflect it to the rope before an ice block will spawn and block the path. Completing this challenge, or just taking the door, will lead us into the next room. The next room is another puzzle, again requiring a stake to be hit. Apparently there would have been a maximum tomato in the center, and Kirby would have to hit the stakes and grab the tomato before it fell off screen. Fast forwarding to 2002, Kirby's Adventure was remade for the Game Boy Advance with updated visuals. And just like the original game, this remake also has a plethora of unused test rooms. But before we get back to those, the remake also has some pretty cool unused stuff as well. First up is a pretty funny crude drawing placeholder icon for the fire ability. The Japanese text above also apparently translates closer to faya than fire, as seen in the final version. I still can't get over this picture. I kinda wish all Kirby icons were stylized like this. Next is another funny piece of unused content that we normally don't get to see on Lost Bits, an unused pause screen. The screen says, "Being careful only takes a minute, but injuries last a lifetime." Dang. Rip Kirby. I'm guessing the screen was meant to be shown when pausing after losing a life. Several unused tiles for the debug rooms can also be found. Interestingly, many of these tiles are actually assets from Kirby's Dream Land 3 that made it here for some reason. And just before getting back to some more unused and unseen areas, I just want to say, holy, these were hard to uncover. Aside from some screenshot layouts of the areas, figuring out how to get here was quite the puzzle, so I guess it makes sense why I couldn't find any video footage of these areas. I guess it's time to be the first. Similar to the original, this game also has a large hub-like unused area with some doors that work and some that don't. This area is also much bigger than any room we've seen so far, and it features a water area to test the swimming mechanics, some explodable blocks, as well as some ramps likely to test Kirby's movement up and down slopes. The next unused room looks to be a general test area for level building. It features a lone Scarfy, some platforms to fall through, and a bunch of blocks, some of which are in the shape of an S for some reason. Maybe S for Sakurai? I don't know. The next room is another long one with a bunch of slopes of varying degrees. Again, this was very likely just used to test Kirby's movement on different grades of ramps. The next unused room features the fire line and some more blocks. Here we can see that some of them have some Japanese text on them. The blocks behind the line translate to hammer, the ones above, easily, and the red ones in the back translate to bomb. Obviously, each of these describe which attack or move can be used to break them. The next area is room to a large body of water and a sort of wind tunnel. It looks like both of these were used to test how the air and water currents would affect Kirby. The next room just has some icy surfaces and spikes, again testing their effects on Kirby. As a little change of pace, the next room has some cannons that were likely used to test their functionality, as well as the vertical scrolling of the screen after Kirby has been shot out of one. There's also a small gang of Scarfies just chilling at the top. It's best not to mess with them. Slightly less interesting is the next room, which is much smaller and only has some slopes and a small body of water. The next unused room is again pretty underwhelming and is just a test room for a mini boss fight. The second last unused room is basically a greatest hits of all the different tested terrain so far, like slopes, spikes, icy blocks, and platforms to fall through. And for the last unused test room we have, guess what? More slopes. All of these slopes are at the top of the screen, so I'm guessing they were used to test how Kirby would react on these slopes at the top, likely to make sure that he wouldn't clip off the screen or anything. Oh, and guess what? It turns out that the Hell Zone also makes a return in this remake. This time it's not as easy to access as in the original, and it requires a cheating device, making it even more interesting that the developers still decided to leave it in the game. This time, however, the broom hatter that was on the L in the original is gone. Alright, so starting things off, we have Kirby's first ever game, Kirby's Dream Land for the Game Boy. And first, we got some important pre-release history to go over.
So before Kirby was known as Kirby, he was originally given the name Po Po Po, which was going to be the contrasting name to DDD. Wait, that actually makes a whole lot of sense.
I know, right? And before the game was known as Kirby's Adventure, it was actually known as the much more epic sounding Twinkle Popo. Yeah, I'm not surprised it was changed. Then, before its initial planned release, when the game caught the eye of Shigeru Miyamoto, he forced HAL to stop development, as he felt the game had much more potential than the state it was currently in, especially if Nintendo published it rather than HAL. Then, just over a year later, the character and game title was renamed to what we know it as today.
Interestingly, there are still several pre-release screenshots out there in which the original Po 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 name is seen as part of the game's graphics. And furthermore, there's an alleged prototype build of the game floating around somewhere too.
I was only able to find a picture of it being played, its title screen, as well as what apparently is its cartridge. That said, I don't think this has been dumped online, as I haven't been able to find a ROM of it anywhere, and I don't think it has been verified as an authentic prototype, so until it is, I guess I'll remain just cautiously optimistic. Anyways, let's get to the actual game itself. First, on top of other more basic and obvious regional differences, such as localizing text and title card graphics, the Japanese version of the configuration menu uses unique graphics for the life bar option.
The international version uses the same one as seen in the game when normally playing it, so it's kinda strange to see here. Our money is on this maybe being some early version of the health meter.
Another major change between regional releases is that due to the much larger size of the title card in the international release, the green's background from the Japanese version was completely removed. And yeah, I get the reasoning, but I think the background was a really nice touch in that version.
Then, as far as actual unused content left over in the game is concerned, there's unfortunately only 3 unused graphics here. Firstly, we have this unused sprite of Waddle Doo looking up, this thought to have been once intended to be used when they charge up their lasers or when Kirby was right above them. And then the other unused graphics are both for big ol' King Dedede. Both of these sprites feature the king facing the player in what appears to be a shocked and frightened state. Although it's not 100% certain due to the darker coloring of these sprites, it's thought that these were intended to be used as the boss introduction for Dedede from the darker side of the wrestling ring.
Now moving on to Kirby's Dream Land 2, we again got some more regional changes and cuts between the different versions. The title screen was changed yet again, yeah sure, pretty standard stuff, but a big notable change between the Japanese and international releases is the complete removal and replacement of a character. So in the Japanese release, one of the friends that can be unboxed in the Kirby loot bags in the game was this girl character known as Chao. Now Chao is actually from another game called Yuyuki for the Famicom Disk System. Yuyuki was never released outside of Japan, so I imagine the developers wanted to swap in a new character that could be, I guess, more relevant in the international releases.
So enter this female version of GUI. This alternate GUI completely replaced Chao in all of the aspects of the game, including the boss endurance and the bonus sub-game results screen, as well as in the test menu where they are seen playing a piano. And fun fact, this sound test image is actually a direct reference to a scene from Yuyuki.
Eventually, Chao would make a return to the Kirby series in all regional releases of Dream Land 3, where she is seen in the 4th stage with her friend Goku. Then, whereas Dream Land 1 only had some unused graphics, Dream Land 2 only has 1 track of unused audio. Here, let's have a listen. Though it can be heard in the game's sound test, it never actually gets implemented anywhere, and wouldn't be until years later it would get repurposed into the track The Cave in the Sky, heard in Kirby Triple Deluxe. So yeah, just like we've seen with Pokemon here on Lost Bits, it's not atypical of Nintendo to reuse stuff that was once scrapped years later.
And last up, of course, we have Kirby's Dream Land 3, and being a Super Nintendo game rather than a Game Boy one, it's no surprise there is a lot more to cover in this installment.
Once again, starting with some regional differences. First, in this Botch Butch screen, the international version scrapped this Nintendo 16 graphic, originally seen at the top in the Japanese release. This is an obvious spoof of the Nintendo 64 logo, as the Super Nintendo was only 16-bit compared to the Nintendo 64's 64. It's a little charming joke, I wish they would have kept it.
Then in the Japanese version of Dream Land 3, the game actually uses the original Nintendo logo in Japanese kanji, which was used from the company's founding in 1889 all the way up until 1950. This is something rarely seen, even in Japanese regional releases.
And although both releases saw these graphics animated, only the Japanese title card for the game was animated, while the international one kinda just sits there. Kinda feeling ripped off here.
Dream Land 3 also has a single audio track that goes unused known as K3 Boss 2. This is actually a remix of the music from the Egg Catcher minigame from Kirby's Adventure, and based on the name of this track, it appears to have been once planned as background music for a boss fight. Let's have ourselves a quick listen.
And last up for this video, I'm pleased to say that Kirby's Dream Land 3 has some surprisingly robust debugging features left over. 7 whole pages here worth, in fact, so let's get to them.
First here is the BG toggle, which when enabled will display all background collision points in the game. OBJ here does something really similar, only this time with collision with other sprites in the foreground. Renew does, again, basically the same thing, only this allows for more collision points to be displayed.
Then the pause toggle here will enable the players to freeze the game completely when pressing start rather than bringing up the regular pause menu, and then after doing so, the game can be advanced frame by pressing the R button. Next up, we have the level and stage selection, which, as you would expect, lets you select a world and a stage to instantly load to. Pretty nifty if you just want to get to a level quickly.
Since there are only 5 worlds in the game, with 6 here being the final boss stage, Level 6 and T have other things to load into, such as the game's minigames, the boss rush, the opening cutscene but in a playable format, but you're also a glitchy boy, and even some unused areas and test rooms, but we'll save that for later in the video. Additionally, T3 here loads the player into a strange, otherwise inaccessible stage, which seems to be a blend of 1-4 and 1-5. We have the mid-boss fight from 1-4, but then there's also this section that looks like it's from 1-5. It's quite strange. Then back to the debug menu, T2, 4, 5, 6, and B all just crash the game, so that's real good. Moving on, stock allows the user to choose the amount of lives they want to have in the game, and similarly, Kirby allows you to choose how much health you want Kirby to start with, including I, which stands for infinite health. GUI does the same thing, but with GUI's health, of course. BG bar doesn't seem to have any effect. Then unit's purpose isn't quite known, but setting it to slow really does tend to slow the game down. Go figure.
Next up, pages 3, 4, and 5 in this debug menu all act as save file editors. In these, you can change the progress of every save file. You can set which stages are cleared, as well as which options are unlocked in the file select screen. S for sound test, M for the MG5 subgame, B is Boss Butch, G is the jumping minigame, and E is the cutscene selection menu.
Then page 6 is Music Room, which, as the name suggests, is basically just another sound test. Here, the only difference, however, is that the file names for some of the songs are also listed. And then lastly, on page 7, we have Autoplay Demo. This apparently is believed to have been used to record player movements, which would then be used for the demo screen seen on the title screen. However, it doesn't seem to work as intended in the retail release, and can even sometimes result in the game deleting all save data. And finally, as a little bonus here, I guess, when holding down the L and R buttons on the title screen, the build date of the release build shows up on screen. And from that, we can see that this version was apparently built on August 18th, 1997 at 6 o'clock.
And finally, we have the best for last. We got not 1, not 2, but 3 unused and normally inaccessible areas left over. First up, let's get through the more basic one here. Loading in takes us to a room consisting of really basic red and black level geometry, as well as a variation of the background from the 5th level of World 1. And you better get used to that red terrain, because we're gonna be seeing a lot of it.
Anyways, yeah, all that's in this room is just a single door. And this door just takes us to another similar room with another single door, which then takes us back to the title screen. Since there's not much going on here, I can only assume this debug area was to test functions of doors and loading between different areas. Yeah, that's about it, so let's move on. Okay, now on to the real good stuff. The next debug area starts us off in a strange room with several spikes everywhere, as well as a few doors. These placeholder spikes were obviously used to test how Kirby reacts to spikes, but there's also this area in the middle which I couldn't fit through even when sliding, so I'm not too sure what that was for. Anyways, one of the doors leads us to an area with some platforms and slopes, but the main focus here appears to be the pool of water at the end, as well as the Shotzo cannon enemies all placed on some placeholder looking star blocks. I guess this could have been used for testing how enemies fall once the tiles beneath them disappear. The next door here leads us to an area with several placeholder pass-through platforms and slopes. Also, of course, as you can see, there are 3 animal friends here, Kine, Ku, and Nago. I think it's pretty obvious this room was to test walking along different slope angles, as well as passing through them, probably with and without the animal friends.
The final door in this test area leads us to yet another room with some platforms and Nago, only this time there are more doors for us to go through. The first one just takes you back to the starting room, but the other door takes us to even more terrain testing. We got some more terrain at different grades here, some you can pass through and some you can't. Some treacherous water, slippery terrain, opposite of slippery terrain, some conveyor styled blocks, again in different angles and directions, and finally at the very end, yet another door, but this one, unfortunately, doesn't actually work. So yeah, that's fun.
And last, but absolutely not least, no really, there's a lot here, is a massive test area with numerous sub-areas found within it. Now the first area we load into contains several doors, each with, I guess, a theme behind it, and I can't read Japanese, but I assume each character above the door probably designates what it is, at least briefly. And as always, if you know what these characters mean, let us know down in the comments. Anyways, first room up brings us to another room with the original 3 animal friends. Then in this next room, we got a door that leads us to another area that we'll come back to later. This door here takes us back to the starting room. And then we also got this door that contains another room with the 3 new animal friends introduced in this game. Based on seeing all the animal friends here, I'm pretty sure these rooms were just meant to test the animal friend mechanics. Then next up, this door leads us to more doors. Yay, and lots of them. Now this is actually an enemy test area, and each of these doors leads us to another room with an assortment of usually 4 enemies or sometimes obstacles. It was pretty fun to bounce around the different rooms and see all the enemies quickly, but oftentimes the enemy selection in a given room felt a bit too dissimilar. Overall though, still pretty cool.
This next door here leads us to a room with a single enemy behind a wall. Since that's all there is to do here, we can only assume that this room was used to test Kirby's ability to suck up an enemy through a wall. Not really sure what else it could be, really. And then, oh, you'll never see it coming, this next door leads us to, you guessed it, even more doors.
The far left door here just connects us back to the friend test rooms. But then starting at the top left here, the first room is just a long corridor with placeholder looking blocks that require a fire move to destroy. Did I mention this was a long corridor? 'Cause it is. A bit too long, if you ask me. Then the next door just leads us to a small area with a single slope. I'd imagine maybe to test how Rock Kirby rolls down it or something. Anyways, then the left middle door here leads us to an area that tests several enemies. Now these enemies all appear to be ones that have a mechanic of grabbing the player, including Mr. Creepy Face Boy here. The middle door is another block test room, as several types of blocks can be found here, each I assume to be destroyed by a different type of copy ability. These placeholder blocks again have Japanese text on them, so I wasn't really sure what exactly I needed to break each type, but I'm sure that's what this is. The next door leads us to basically the same room again, only this time the blocks are arranged in a U shape.
Now moving on to the bottom row, the first door leads to an area with some small angled conveyor belt type terrain. Again, just to test how they would work at different angles. The second door leads to a water area to test how the character behaves in water. The third door leads to a variety of more sloped terrain assets, and another unusable door. Nothing we haven't seen already. Then finally in this little group, this door here takes us to an area with a few gaps to fly up, as well as an area that only allows Kirby to run through by himself. I guess this might have been an area to test collision differences between Kirby with an animal friend and Kirby by himself, and I also assume these bottom 4 doors were all centered around just more terrain testing.
Then to the right of the star door here, which just takes us back to the starting debug room, these 2 doors lead to rooms that test the game's water current mechanics. The first, horizontal moving currents, and then the second one, currents moving upward. Following suit, the next door in the main debug area leads us again to a collection of more doors, and these all deal with air currents this time. Each room here basically just has an area testing currents in different directions. You pretty much have to come here with Coo the Owl, otherwise many of these rooms will just result in a soft lock, as Kirby can't fly against the wind alone. Moving on, you know the drill, one door leads to more doors. Surprise, surprise. The first one here is just another small area with different inclines and a 2-way platform, and then the second is much more interesting as it contains a mountain of little star pieces as well as a stack of 1-ups. Now you could say I've felt a lot of good things in my day, but damn, grabbing that stack of 1-ups, that felt good. And the last door here leads us to, I guess, an item testing room, as 4 different items appear here in just a floating variety, as well as being held up by 2 star blocks. Pretty nifty, I guess.
This next door just leads to a test for the end of level jumping minigame. Pretty self-explanatory there. Then this door leads us to a collection of more doors, which then lead to a test fight with each of the game's mid-bosses. And finally, the last door in this debug room has a big old B over it, which I guess stands for boss, because similar to the last one, this door leads to a collection of more doors, each of which lead to one of the game's main bosses. These last two are super handy for just getting into boss fights with no fuss, and that's nice.
Whew, and those are all the debug and test rooms in Dreamland 3. It's been a while since we've been graced with a game here on Lost Bits with so many testing rooms. You know, I love this stuff. It's always so fun to mess around in these rooms, and this game was certainly no exception. So, to kick things off for this video, we of course have to start off with this game's development history. And if you're unfamiliar with it, development history this game sure did have. And essentially, several whole games became Lost Bits in the journey to the release of this final product. Basically, it took a whopping 11 years of development to make this game, and honestly, it seems like it's almost a miracle that it even happened at all. I'm sure there are several videos on YouTube that cover the development of this game in more detail, but here we'll just go over a quicker rundown to give some more context. Anyways, development for a new Kirby game started in the year 2000, soon after the release of Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards. Development for this game had started on the GameCube, and the plan was to keep the 2.5D style that was featured in Crystal Shards, but to also incorporate a co-op multiplayer aspect, something that was severely lacking in the N64 game. Eventually, after over 4 years of development, a short 52-second world premiere trailer of the game made its debut at E3 of 2005 with the temporary working title of just Kirby's Adventure. This trailer featured Kirby plowing through enemies using a bunch of his signature different copy abilities, as well as a brand new ability where Kirby could seemingly discard an ability in order to spawn a buddy character that would presumably be controllable by another player. We then see footage of a boss fight against a large robot known as HRD3, as well as more gameplay seemingly showing off the 4-player co-op aspect of this game, including a small snippet of the classic fight against Wispy Woods. And although the game seemed like it was pretty far along in development at this point, this, along with some screenshots, was the last we'd ever see of this game, at least in this state. 1 year went by, and then another, and still no more signs of this Kirby game were seen, and this started making Kirby fans concerned as the game was seemingly appearing and disappearing from lists of upcoming Nintendo games. But when asked about the state of the Kirby GameCube game, then Senior Director of Corporate Communications, Beth Llewellyn, had said to not forget about Kirby, and had basically revealed that the project had not been abandoned and even moved over to the Nintendo Wii. However, despite this reassurance, several years went by with no new main series console Kirby game news coming from Nintendo. And after seeing Kirby's epic yarn announced for the Wii, fans were starting to think that that was what the GameCube game had turned into, and that the 2.5D style Kirby sequel had been canned. But a few years later, a financial briefing from Nintendo revealed that in fact, another new Kirby game was in development for the Wii. And only a few months later, new footage for the upcoming sequel was shown off, and finally, at E3 of 2011, the game was officially revealed as Kirby Wii. Both of these trailers showed off a pre-release build of Kirby's Return to Dreamland, where, although overall it looks pretty complete, a few small changes can be noted. Stuff like the heads-up display graphics being different, some textures were more basic, and the worst difference was that Kirby's cake here didn't have any frosting in the E3 trailer. This is so sad. Anyways, there are quite a few more smaller changes seen in these builds when compared to the final release, but in the interest of time I won't be going over them here, but as always, if you're interested in reading up on all of them, there's a very handy list of all the documented changes over on the cutting room floor, which also, as always, will be linked for you down in the description. Now you may be wondering, what exactly happened in those years between the GameCube trailer and the final release for it to be delayed for so long? Well, thankfully, we have at least some context given to us for what was going on behind the scenes. For one, according to one of the Iwata Asks interviews, the GameCube game that was shown off wasn't the only Kirby game that was sent back to the drawing board, as there were actually a total of 3 Kirby games that were cancelled. One of these was another more traditional 2D side-scrolling Kirby game, while the other one was a new fully 3D experience, something that, at the time, had never been done in a Kirby game before. The side-scrolling game was supposed to have been made in the style of a pop-up book, and the 3D Kirby game would have featured an interesting isometric view, kind of like Super Mario 3D World. It's unclear if or how much of this game was repurposed into Kirby and the Forgotten Land on the Switch, but of course there are some similarities. And unfortunately, outside of just these 2 screenshots, this is all that's really known about these 2 cancelled games. Now, several factors were given for the decision to scrap the concepts for these 2 games, as well as the GameCube game that was shown off at E3 of 2005. Either the movement didn't feel right, the developers wanted to deliver more of a surprise to the fans, as well as apparent difficulties in developing a Kirby game that could be played both single player as well as multiplayer. But overall, as the saying goes, it seems like these 3 cancelled games walked so Kirby's Return to Dreamland could run, so to speak. Now furthermore, there is actually a whole ton of concept art for the game that reveals a bunch of really cool scrapped ideas that were never shown off in any of the cancelled games, and of course never made it into Return to Dreamland either. There's everything from concepts of some landscapes, a bunch of enemies, some sort of train-themed boss or stage, a scrapped concept for the main menu of the game, an old version of HRD3 where it was designed much more similar to and also controlled by King Dedede, and this is also different to how it was seen in the original GameCube trailer. There's concept art of this fella that's believed to have been meant to be the game's original final boss. And finally, my favorite is this concept art of Morpho Knight, who, was actually once intended to make a debut in the scrapped Kirby GameCube game way before Kirby Star Allies. Anyways, that's a brief look into the history of the games that were scrapped in the long journey paving the way for what eventually became Kirby's Return to Dreamland. Alright, now let's switch gears and talk about the unused content that's left over in the final retail release of the game. And to start things off, let's have a look at some unused graphics. Firstly, there are leftover textures for several enemies that reveal a hurt expression for each that was scrapped. For the Waddle-Doo enemies, there's this texture that would have made it look like its eye was tearing up. There's this texture for the hotheads that would make them look like they're grimacing in pain. And then there are also eye-closing textures for both the Cappies as well as Krabbies. It's unclear why exactly these didn't end up getting used, but interestingly, although slightly altered, many of these did go on to be implemented in the next Kirby game built using this engine, Kirby Triple Deluxe. Then similarly, although not necessarily for a damaged state, there are unused angry expression textures for the Togekukis as well as the Ticks. Then next is this texture of Kirby's bomb hat that reveals an alternate design to the party hat style seen in this game. It bears obvious resemblance to the old blue hat style seen in prior games, so it looks like initially that style was going to also be seen here before the decision was made to change to the new one. Next, we have an alternate design for this fella named Wolf. Although generally the same, you'll immediately notice that the unused version lacks the blue top of its head, and additionally, the eye texture is different and looks more refined in the final iteration. And also, there's this texture that's for an unused state for the Wolves for closing their eyes, once again thought to be for a damaged state. And similarly to the Wolves, there's also this early texture for the Needlos enemies. It's not quite as different as the Wolf one, but the textures just seem more simple compared to the final version. And similar to that, there are also 2 unused textures for the coconuts that the bonker enemies throw at you. One in a simpler, more cartoon-like style, as well as pretty much on the opposite side, there's one in a more realistic style too. And then lastly for the enemy textures, there are a bunch of eye and body textures for the Gulbo and Water Gulbo enemies. And then, although the texture itself isn't unused, there's actually an eye that's hidden in the textures for the Flamer enemies that's never normally seen otherwise. Then, beyond just being an unused texture, there's actually a whole unused enemy that's left over in the files of the game. This fella is listed as a Hearbell, and it appears to be some sort of flower enemy, and it would apparently either gobble up Kirby or latch onto him similarly to how the Pacto enemies do. Thankfully, to give us more context, there are also several animations left over for the Here Bell enemy as well, and these, of course, also go unused. Now next up, there are also some unused graphics related to a pair of the game's bosses. First, there are several unused textures for Goliath with some darker skin as well as rocking a red coat of fur instead of white as is seen in the used version. Additionally, there are a bunch of textures for Goliath's eyes blinking in a regular as well as powered up enraged state. And then the other set of unused boss graphics are for none other than Kirby series staple Wispy Woods, where in addition to an unused body texture, there are also 2 unused sets of bushes where they look quite cartoony. Now this is 1000% speculation, but these kind of look similar in style to the scrapped pop-up book style Kirby game that we went over earlier, so maybe these are some sort of remnant from that game. Next up, we got this unused placeholder graphic listed in the folder for ability icons simply as water, with the Japanese text here translating to temporary. So if you're Galaxy Brain and can put 2 and 2 together here, this appears to be a placeholder tile for the water ability. And then, strangely, there's also this unused graphic of Kirby inhaling a Waddle Dee and spitting it back out as a star. And what makes this interesting is that this is actually artwork from Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland for the Game Boy Advance. Now this graphic is found amongst those used for the tutorial windows that pop up in the first few stages of the game, so this was probably a placeholder image that was used to test those before the proper ones were made up. Then moving on, next up we have some unused textures of what looks to be King Dedede as well as a pair of eyes, and these are actually found amongst those for HRD3. This would make sense, as we discussed earlier that HRD3 was originally designed after King Dedede and would have even been controlled by him, so I guess these being left in here are a remnant from those plans for the original GameCube version that was shelved. And also found amongst the files for HRD3 is this unused texture for the Warp Star. When placed over the Warp Star model, we can see that this appears to be an early texture for the star of sorts. Now next up are several unused graphics relating to Kirby's copy abilities. First, and frankly not as interesting, are several early versions of a bunch of the ability icons used for the challenge rooms. And these, at first inspection, may look about the same, and it isn't until you look really closely where you can start seeing that the early and unused variants are found in a lower quality. The biggest difference, however, is seen in the ability icon that's used for the item challenge rooms, where Kirby's smile was changed, his pupils removed, the shapes were changed, and oh yeah, the background used to be red instead of white. Now, although seen for the ninja ability icon, there's also this unused texture that was meant for one of the challenge door icons too. No ninja challenge stage is ever seen in the game, so this suggests that there may have once been one planned that was cut. Next up, there are actually 2 unused textures of a stopwatch that would have been for an also unused copy ability, or rather, lack thereof. Yeah, these are textures for Kirby's default state as well as a default super ability that are left in the game. Since you can just get rid of a copy ability at any point, there's really no other point in these, and yeah, that's probably why these were scrapped. On the other hand though, there are also 2 super abilities that were cut from the game that are more interesting, the first of these being the Super Spark. Now apparently the data for this ability was overwritten by the Ultra Sword, so all we have left of this ability is this star icon, so all we can really do is speculate as to how it would function. Thankfully enough though, on the flip side, the other super ability that was cut has a bit more left over for us, and this is for the Super Cutter. In addition to the star icon graphic, there's also a leftover graphic for the hat to be used on Kirby's head in the heads-up display, and there's even an unused model for the hat left in the game too. And then to top it all off, there are even leftover animations for Kirby that were going to be used as part of this move, where we can see him throwing and catching the cutter both on the ground as well as in the air. Now it's not 100% clear why either of these super abilities were scrapped, but at least for the Super Cutter, it's theorized that it might have gotten the snips since it might have been deemed a bit too similar to Kirby's Ultra Sword ability. And now, speaking of unused animations, we've already mentioned a few, but there are actually a whole truckload more of these kicking around in the files of this game. First up, we have unused animations for a bunch of enemies. Now, I mentioned the tick enemies earlier with their scrapped angry expression, but there are also unused animations for them where they would be seen just bobbing up and down. Then there are unused animations for the broom hatters slipping and falling down, sliding, as well as standing back up, Chili transitioning into and performing a jump, as well as an idle pose, which, although isn't used in the final game, was actually briefly seen in the original E3 trailer for the shelved GameCube game. There's an unused idle animation for the Needlos enemies, several for the Scarfy, including for them jumping, which they never do since they, well, fly. There's animations for both Naughty and Sir Kibble walking, neither of which ever happen in the game. Attacking animations for Como as well as Togekuki, several unused animations for both the regular Waddle Dees as well as the Halcandron variants. There's a bunch of unused animations for the Poppy Bros where they can be seen walking both on and off of a bomb, as well as falling and landing with one. And there are even some unused animations for a few of the game's mini-bosses too. We got unused flinching animations for the Gigant Edge, similar flinching animations for Kibble Blade, as well as one where it's seen struggling. And then there are also several unused spinning and teleporting animations for the Dubois mini-boss, including this one really weird test one where it's like slowly squishing down and then coming back to normal size. And lastly, for the enemies, there are scrapped animations for the Kabu enemies teleporting. This was basically their signature move for every Kirby game they appeared in up until this one, and for whatever reason, they haven't done it ever since. Now next up, we already went over a few unused animations for Kirby, but there are actually a whole bunch more left over in the game, as well as some for a few of the other playable characters. For the Pink Puff himself, we got him teetering with the Parasol ability, large cheek teetering with something in his mouth, sliding on his face as well as sliding on his back, getting up from sliding in both respective positions, hanging onto rope as well as struggling to do so. And then there are a few unused or early animations of Kirby relating to the beam ability, including some sort of unused attack where Kirby would seemingly charge up a beam attack. Next, there are some for the ninja ability for Kirby missing a grab, some for Bomb Kirby throwing a bomb on the ground, throwing a bomb mid-air, both forwards and downwards, as well as charging up a bomb mid-air. There's a test animation for the tornado ability, as well as Kirby getting dizzy and still spinning. There's a strange unused animation of Kirby yawning after getting the sleep ability. There's some sort of ability get animation where Kirby flips in the air before supposedly transforming into another ability form. And then there are also a few unused animations for Spear Kirby where Kirby is all squished and angry. And lastly for Kirby, there's an unused animation where he cycles through a bunch of facial expressions, and actually a similar one also exists for Bandana Waddle Dee, though it has less facial expressions so it doesn't cycle as long. Then moving on to King Triple D, there's this unused test animation which looks similar to the one that's used when he rides Landia, so it's believed that this was an early version of that. And then secondly, there's also this unused animation for the king attacking underwater in a large circle swing. In the final version, this never gets used as he just does a more simple vertical swing instead. Then lastly, for the playable characters, there are a few unused animations for Meta Knight, including several animations borrowed from Galacta Knight, as well as this one where Meta Knight just plops down, stares at his sword, and ponders the galaxy for a little while. Now, I hope you're not tired of the unused animations yet, because we have a few more to go for a few unused models left over in the game. The first of these is for an unused icy object listed as Ice Blizzard, which is also left with this shimmering animation, and these are apparently meant for the Sphere Doomers, and more specifically, presumably in the Ice Blizzard form. Then for this unused model of a golden door cover, there's also this unused animation of it shimmering too, and then there's this unused undulating animation for this thing listed as Bubble, and this is apparently some sort of weapon that was meant for the main antagonist in the game. And finally, the last unused model is actually a duplicate of Kirby that's found amongst the files for the Mike ability. Although almost identical to Kirby, by using the same textures, they don't appear to display properly, and he ends up looking like this instead. Ooh, that's gotta be a record for the most unused animations I think I've ever covered in a single video. Anyways, with those out of the way now let's talk about some of the bits of audio that go unused in Kirby's Return to Dreamland. Now first up, there are two sound effects that go unused, both of which are for Magalore. Both of these sound a bit less intense than how they're heard in the final game. Then next, there are several unused songs left over in the game too. A bunch of these are just earlier and lower quality versions of tracks that are heard in the game or are just lacking a small intro segment, so for this video we'll just skip over some of those and focus more on what I believe are more interesting tracks that go unused in the game. For starters, there's a track from the Japanese Super Nintendo release Kirby no Kira Kira Kizu, or Kirby Star Stacker as it was released on the Game Boy outside of Japan. Next up is a cut shorter fanfare track that, based on the GCK in the name, is thought to have maybe been a leftover from the original GameCube plans for this game. Interestingly enough, apparently this track was later repurposed and used in Kirby Star Allies, as well as in all of the Kirby games on the 3DS. Then next up are two more fanfares that are theorized to have been meant for entering one of the game's hidden dimensional portals. There's one that sounds more cheery, as well as one more ominous sounding one. Next, we got another upbeat track listed as HEITI1, and this appears to be a remix of the song Green Greens and Over the Hills. Now, this word is apparently a transliterated Japanese word that, when translated to English, means plains. So, based on that, this appears to have been possibly meant as a track for the Cookie Country level. Next, there are alternate versions of two tracks that seem to use quite different instrumentation between the unused early version and the final one. These include an early, more retro-sounding track for Sky Tower, and then similarly for Cave Expedition as well. And then, lastly, for the unused audio, there are a few alternate themes for the super ability theme played when using the Ultra Sword in the Grand Doomer boss fight. There are 3 of these unused variations, each sounding slightly different, so here's a quick sample of all 3, as well as a comparison to the final one that's used. moving along, there's actually a really cool purple switch left over in the files that unfortunately never ended up getting used, at least in this game. Now this button still has leftover functionality that, as seen in this gameplay by Reserved, can toggle stuff like doors open and closed to however a player would want. Similar switches can be seen in this game in other colors like blue, which gets permanently pressed once activated, as well as red ones which are activated only temporarily. But yeah, these purple ones that could be toggled on and off at will never made the cut, and yeah, like I said, not in this game, as they would apparently eventually get repurposed in the future 3DS titles in the series. Next up, there are archived file path text references to a whole bunch of unused maps for this game, a whopping 335 in fact. There's everything here, from test rooms for various abilities, bosses, as well as just a bunch of general test maps it seems. Now, to my immense disappointment, and you know how much I love my test maps, unfortunately, aside from just these file paths teasing us, there's no other remnants of these maps left over in the game. So yeah, they unfortunately aren't accessible or anything like that. F's in the chat. It's really unfortunate, but I just wanted to bring this up here to share my pain. Hopefully someday a prototype build of this game or something surfaces where maybe some of these will still be intact. Anyways, next up, there are actually 3 unused cutscenes that are left over in the game, and these can actually still be re-enabled with some cheats. The first of these is listed as Prototype Movie OP, with OP likely standing for opening, as this seems to be an early version of the game's opening, as it appears very similar to the opening in the game with only a few visual effects missing. Then, on the flip side, there's Prototype Movie ED, and this likely stands for ending, and this time we can see the Lore Starcutter ship floating in space and getting rebuilt with its various parts. The cutscene then transitions to several panning shots of the rebuilt ship docked on the ground before a "to be continued" fades onto the screen. And then lastly, there's an unnamed unused cutscene left over that starts with a 3-2-1 countdown before a very similar cutscene to the first part of the previous one starts playing. It's largely the same, only this time the space background appears different, as here the stars zipping by appear much brighter. And now, last up for this video, there's actually a lone debug feature that's left over for us in the final release of this game, and this is an ability to visualize the hitboxes of Kirby, enemies, as well as certain objects in the game. Each color of hitbox here also apparently relates to a certain effect. For example, grab hitboxes are colored green, damage hitboxes are red, etc. Although I do wish there were some more debug features left over, this is still a pretty cool one to have left in, and it's an interesting way to visualize how some enemies damage Kirby. Alright, so for starters, there are actually a few websites for this game where whoever was making them opted to use screenshots from earlier pre-release builds of the game. First up, we got a Japanese website for the game from 2004, the year that the game was initially released on the Game Boy Advance. Changes seen in these screenshots include more minor stuff like the corners of platforms being less polished, the brightness of the background here being increased, the walls surrounding this bomb and these stone blocks were improved in the final version to not awkwardly just cut off. These platforms were seen a bit higher in the earlier version, the cannon here in Mustard Mountain was incorrectly placed, not only uncentered on the wick, but also, well, in the ground. This level was actually misspelled as mountain on the map screen here, and we can also see that the buttons would have had different effects too. Instead of using L and R to move between areas, originally the A button would have been used to move to the next area, and instead L and R would have been used to zoom in and out of the map. And similarly, on the world map menu, instead of using select to switch maps here, the A button is seen here originally. Then for the screenshot of the Speed Eaters minigame, the shading on the Kirbys was updated, as was the background here. For Crackety Hack, all the number UI graphics got better shading, the meter for the crack originally showed the distance in meters instead of showing 2 zeros as is seen in the final, and then probably the most obvious change here is that the pedestal on which the minigame's winner stands on was completely revamped from a pink one to a simpler looking blue design. Another interesting change on this site can be seen in a screenshot of the collection room where the graphics for the spray paint cans here look much simpler in the early version, as they lack the shading to give them more depth as is seen in the final. And then similarly, across the board of all the screenshots of the regular gameplay, the cell phone graphic was also altered. Not only was the phone changed from a flip phone to a phone of the non-clamshell variety, but the antenna was also included in the outline in the final graphic too. I guess Kirby had to trade in the old Motorola Razr. Oh, also, sometimes the area's name was missing or the brackets surrounding the number were seen in light blue instead of the final release's pink in the bottom right of the screen here. Now, okay, having early screenshots of the game for a website dating back to 2004 isn't all out there. But what if I told you that a similar thing happened much later in 2017? Yup, as part of celebrating Kirby's 25th anniversary in 2017, a video showcasing a bunch of the Pink Puff's copy abilities was released on the official Japanese Nintendo YouTube account. And wouldn't you know it, for whatever reason, the gameplay from Kirby and the Amazing Mirror that was used, again appears to be from an earlier build of the game. I guess whoever was recording footage for this video just decided to use a pre-release build. And as you'd expect from another early build, some more changes can be noted here. Across the board, just like we saw in some of the other early screenshots, whatever build they used for the footage here just didn't have the name of the room in the bottom right of the screen. The background tiles for this cave are quite different. The floor here was originally a solid floor that Kirby couldn't jump through, unlike the thin platform seen in the final build. And then for this room, there was apparently originally a QP enemy here that was removed, and then the passage up here past this slope wasn't implemented yet at this point either. And if something made in 2017 wasn't close enough for you, I kid you not, the website for HAL Labs, the main developers of Kirby games, actually features screenshots from a pre-release version of the game, like right now on their current website. We can again see the early flip phone graphics. The health meter appears to be different in this screenshot. The background graphic here was moved. Some grass was added both here and here to embellish the ground, I guess. The area names are, big surprise, missing again here. And then in this screenshot of the central circle area, the main mirror is using an earlier graphic, and we can also see that the pillars around the mirror to Olive Ocean have some different coloring as well. Like I said, having screenshots from pre-release versions of the game for a website the year that the game was released is one thing, but seeing pre-release builds being used in promotional material almost 20 years after the game's initial release is, I think, pretty crazy. And now for the latter half of this video, found in the Gekken Nintendo demo discs from 2004 is a pre-release demo build of Kirby and the Amazing Mirror that apparently dates back to a build date of December 2003, or about 3.5 months before the initial release of the game in Japan. And despite being so close to the release date, there are still quite a few differences here compared to the final release. For starters, despite still being in the game's files, almost half of the items, enemies, and objects never go used in this demo build. These include the regular and 8-directional Kirby cannons, the Shotso enemy, the energy drink healing item, and more. And in addition to those, several copy abilities are also never normally obtainable in this build, including the UFO, the Master Sword, Missile, Mini, Burn, Throw, Sleep, Cook, Crash, Tornado, as well as Magic. Now I say normally because a few of them can still be forced into the game by editing its memory, though as we'll see, they aren't exactly complete. For example, for the UFO ability, the proper UFO Kirby sprite isn't used, and additionally, the beam attack stops like halfway through as though it hit a barrier or something. Then for the Smash ability, Kirby's arm is actually animated for the Vulcan jab move instead of disappearing as is seen in the final version. The Twinkle Star spin move appears to have a much smaller area of effect as well as a different motion graphic. And to add to that, the graphic for the icon of this ability is also different here, despite it not normally even being visible. Here, Kirby is seen closing his eyes, and then probably the biggest change is that originally the Super Smash Bros. Logo could be seen in the background. Kirby's Smash copy ability's moveset was modeled after Kirby's from Super Smash Bros. Melee, and HAL Labs developed both games, so although it's kind of weird that this logo was removed, I guess the idea was to maybe make Kirby contrast more with the background in this graphic. And lastly, again, despite not ever normally being accessible in this build, the Master Sword ability also saw a few graphical changes. For one, much like the regular sword ability, in this build, Kirby is seen wearing the iconic green hat when wielding the Master Sword, and not only during regular gameplay either, but also in the map screen graphics as well as the heads-up display icon too. It's unclear why this decision was made to get rid of the green hat, but if I had to guess, maybe it was to further differentiate the ability from the regular sword. Now, those are some changes to the abilities that aren't normally accessible, but there are also a few changes, mostly minor, to the ones that you can obtain by normal means in this demo build. First, Bomb Kirby can throw the bombs a bit faster in the prototype. Stone Kirby appears a bit brighter in the prototype, and among some other differences, if you run into transforming into Stone Kirby, the prototype version actually gives you a small boost of speed that lets you roll slightly further. Sword Kirby's combos take a bit longer to start, Spark Kirby's crown and flaming spark hair appear slightly darker in this demo version. When using the cutter ability, the cutter falls entirely off screen in the prototype after hitting an object, instead of it just disappearing almost right away. And then lastly, the fighter ability probably saw the most changes. The side air B attack used to give Kirby more momentum in the air, the low charge Hadouken attack is missing in the demo and Kirby can pretty much fully charge it almost immediately. And most different is that the neutral B attack in the air used to do a downward kick move instead of a side spinning kick, and this downward kick was eventually moved to the down B in air slot for the final version. Next up, there are actually two enemies left over in this build that weren't used in the final release of this game. First, we got this little blue guy, who bears some resemblance to the shooty enemies that are seen in this game. And as we can see from these graphics that are left over, it looks like it would have turned into a ball, likely when jumping. Now, although it's not 100% confirmed, there are only two unused health bar name graphics left over in this game. One for another unused enemy we'll get to a bit, and then one for a Stoppy. And since this guy is the only other unused enemy here, it's fairly likely that this was meant for this fella. Anyways, the other unused enemy is much more detailed and has many more leftover sprites for everything from walking to throwing something, taking damage, and more. And like I mentioned, the other health bar name is meant for this fella and it refers to it as Tokon. I hope I said that right. Now unfortunately, despite having all of these sprites, in this build of the game, pretty much all other coding for this enemy has been gutted. But just based on its appearance resembling a wind-up clock or timer, it's been theorized that it may have been planned to throw music notes as its attack. In any case, at the end of the day, neither Stoppy or Tokon here ever got to appear in the final cut. Now let's go over some of the more notable audio differences in this earlier build. And to start things off here, even the title screen music is slightly different here, notably featuring a heavier bass track compared to how it's heard in the final. The theme heard when Dark Meta Knight first fights regular Meta Knight in the game's intro cutscene has a slightly different intro. Then in gameplay sections, although not normally playable in this build, the music for the beginning area in this demo version uses the Vegetable Valley track from Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland. And I guess this was used as a placeholder until the final remix of the forest and nature area was later implemented. Then, just like with the title screen, the music used for the forest and nature area in this build also features a louder bass track. And bass fans stay winning, as big shocker, the bass track in the central circle area is once again louder in this demo version. music for the space area is missing the epic synth scale leading into the song's bridge section. Then, in the prototype, the synth heard in the Dark Meta Knight battle has like some weird modulation effect applied to it that makes it sound super unsettling. Here's a quick comparison of the two. Yeah, pretty creepy. Next up, this prototype also has a fair bit of graphics that were updated or changed for the final release. And things, once again, start at the title screen itself, where here, quite a few changes can be seen with the game's logo. Mostly, the colors were changed and outlines were made darker and more thick, and as you can see, this made the text and everything else stand out that much more. Then other graphical differences include Kirby's animation for him calling on his phone being slower in the prototype, and more obviously is that it's lacking the waves coming out of the antenna. And then speaking of the cell phone, although it wasn't the flip phone variety in this demo, the antenna wasn't included in the whole outline again, and there was a black button on the phone that was changed to a red in the final version. And then other changes include the world map looking much brighter and vivid in this prototype. The center of the gray dimensional mirror star used to have some lines around it, and then probably one of the most minor graphical differences I've ever covered, the mirror to Rainbow Root is a whopping 1 pixel lower in the prototype. Crazy, I know. This prototype also actually has a unique graphic that isn't in the final cut, and that's of this screen that's used when the player completes the demo after defeating the King Golem boss. This screen has the 4 Kirby saying farewell to the player and shows off the upcoming March 2004 release date of the game in Japan. Then, in addition to the used graphics that were altered, the prototype build also has its fair share of graphics left over in the game that aren't normally ever seen. These include the misspelling of Mustard Mountain we saw in the pre-release screenshots earlier, which doesn't get used in this build since the levels' names aren't ever shown. There is the less shaded Kirby sprites for the Speed Eaters minigame, and we can also see that Kirby's jump for winning the minigame was also changed from him just being happy to him being nice and full. The first gate in Peppermint Palace is different and more so resembles the second gate that's seen in the final cut. Then, much like the gray dimensional mirror, the restored gold version also has the lines around the star in the prototype here. Dark Meta Knight sprite was slightly changed, with the unused prototype version having gold trim on the shoulder pads, burning eyes, as well as a slightly different color palette overall. And lastly, there are also unused graphics of Kirby with the Missile, Mini, and Cupid abilities exiting the hub doors from Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland. Now, all 3 of these never get used in the prototype, but interestingly, the Cupid one actually also remained left over in the final cut of Amazing Mirror, but once again, it remained unused. Then lastly, for the unused graphics, although not ever normally visible, left over in the prototype are also early versions of the pause screen for a bunch of Kirby's copy abilities, or lack thereof. Now, although for the most part, these early versions look fairly similar to the ones that were used in this demo, as well as in the final release, a few changes can also be noted. The early versions lack the copy ability icon graphic in the bottom right, and instead just have a green square as a placeholder. The text graphics were pretty crude and obviously touched up. Sometimes entirely different graphics were used or added, like for the cutter and bomb pause menus here. And originally it looks like some of the pause menus didn't include a tutorial screen on how to use the ability. And then sometimes, like with the sword and sleep abilities here, the pause menus actually underwent at least 2 revisions, as we can see that the unused prototype screens, the ones that are used in the prototype, and the ones that went on to be used in the final cut are all different. Now, what's extra interesting is that pretty much all of these unused early pause screens here bear more resemblance to the ones that were used in Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland. But then, the most interesting of all of these unused pause screens is one that wasn't used at all in this prototype, the final release, or any other known build of this game. Now this pause screen has this placeholder drawing of Kirby face down in a puddle of red, jam, and seemingly has his soul leaving his body. And if you have any doubts, the text at the top here translates to escaped, and then in the parentheses, the text translates to dead or Foa, which is a practice in both Buddhism and Hinduism that relates to the transfer of consciousness at the time of death. The other text here translates to, I knew it was impossible, and something came out. Now, of course, although the Kirby series has seen some uneasy stuff like O2, or heck, even the final boss of this game, this graphic would probably send this game into the T for Teen ESRB rating, so it would have had to have been changed. But it's currently not 100% clear what this pause screen was actually for. It has been speculated, however, that it could have been meant for either if the player would pause the game just after Kirby died, or also, what I think is more likely, that this was an early placeholder pause screen for Kirby's Ghost ability. The Ghost ability ended up being introduced in the next 2D side-scrolling Kirby game, Kirby Squeak Squad, so it's entirely possible that there might have been once plans to introduce it here. And since that ability deals with transferring consciousness, I think that only solidifies that theory. Alright, and now finally getting to the gameplay, there are actually a few changes as well. In addition to the game mode, safe select, or any of the other main menu things not being in this demo build, you can't press the L button to warp out of a level here, and instead it will just call the other Kirbys, and overall enemies encountered and their placement is often different in this build compared to the final. Oh, and also the game immediately kicks you into the central circle area with no intro cutscenes of Dark Meta Knight or Kirby or anything. Then there are also a few differences in some of the level layouts as well. The floor in the King Golem fight is lower in the prototype. Originally, this cherry found here used to be contained in this treasure chest. The background of this section in Moonlight Mansion was pretty different in this build, and honestly looks much better as I think it really looks like you're still inside of the mansion. The switch under this golem here is missing in this demo, and this golem activates when Kirby is on the right of it rather than on the left as it was changed to for the final cut. This room in Moonlight Mansion lacks the ability trophies seen in the final, the door you enter from gets blocked off in the demo for some reason, and the switch graphic remains here instead of disappearing after it's pressed. But then probably the biggest change of them all is that this area of Rainbow Root was actually changed quite a bit from being a horizontal one into the vertical one that's used in the final. Now, last up for this video, there are actually a few cool debugging features found in this prototype version as well, 3 to be exact. First up, we have an error handler menu. There isn't all too much to toy around with here, it being an error handler and all, but the Japanese text in the middle translates to communication error. Check all connections and try again. So yeah, this appears to have been meant for perhaps testing the multiplayer functionality for the game, or at least that's the error that it handles by default. Secondly, we have a sound test menu. Now, we've seen these plenty of times over the years on Lost Bits, and as per usual, this menu, of course, lets you scroll through and listen to all of the game's music as well as sound effects. Not too much else to say about this one, but it's obviously nifty for listening to specific tracks and sound effects by themselves. Oh, and yeah, how could I forget? We also have these little golems here that do a little move when you swap between scrolling through the music and sound effects. And then last, but certainly not least, is my favorite of the trio here, and this one is a sprite test menu. Much like the sound test, this one, like the name implies, lets the user view all of the game's sprites and associated animations. So you can scroll through all of the sprites of Kirby and his animations for all of the copy abilities, various objects, as well as enemies, even the unused ones. And in addition to being able to move the right sprite around, another interesting function is that by pressing the A and start buttons at the same time, the sprite on the left side will be given the fire hat from Kirby's fire ability. And yeah, not only can you do this for Kirby, this can also be applied to stuff like enemy sprites, which is honestly equally cool as it is strange. Overall, I really enjoy playing around with the sprite test menus, as it's kind of like looking through a compendium of all of the game's characters. Alright, so first things first, it looks like my previous video didn't age all too well already, as a few days after it was released, more information was discovered that reveals that the previously documented information regarding this unused enemy was incorrect. Although for a while it was believed that this fellow was named Tokon based on some health bar graphics, more research was done recently by Sunny, the lead administrator of Kirbypedia, and it turns out that its name was actually Stoppy, and Tokon was actually an early name for the Bang Bang enemies seen in the game instead. Now, many of you had noted in the comments that this enemy looks like a stopwatch, and I guess Stoppy the stopwatch does make more sense for the name. And this also leads to the question of this fella who was previously believed to have been named Stoppy. Since it's been documented that the other enemy is now Stoppy, there's no other name graphic associated for this guy, so this nameless enemy is now just thought to be an unused variant of the shooty enemy. Anyways, it's cool that this has been cleared up now. And since we're already talking about Stoppy, let's chat about leftover data for it, as well as some other unused objects left in the game. Now, although all of the associated sprites for Stoppy that we saw left over unused in the prototype build were completely removed for the final release, not only is coding for this enemy still found kicking around, but it can actually still be re-implemented too. Although the game defaults to loading in the Golem enemy sprite in an obviously incorrect color palette since the proper graphics for this enemy were removed, we can see its health bar graphic load in properly, and we can also get a glimpse at how the Stoppy enemy would behave. When loaded in, the enemy will follow you around, jump, and it can also climb walls too. Unfortunately, however, it doesn't look like we can see its ability where it looks like it would have thrown something at the player though. Then, similar to this, there's also leftover data in the final game for 2 unused mid-bosses and even 2 unused big bosses. Unfortunately, however, this just appears to be dummy data, as not only do they once again default to appear as golems, this time they don't even move around and can only turn to face whichever way the player is from them. Kinda sucks that it isn't anything more interesting, but cool that it's still left over nonetheless. Next, we actually have an unused object that houses cutscenes for when the Kirbys encounter and ultimately defeat the final boss of the game. And in addition to the ones that are used, there are 2 cutscenes that are slightly different than ones that are seen. The first of these is for when Kirby encounters Dark Meta Knight in the final fight, and the only change with this one is that there's an unused question mark graphic that appears above a single Kirby's head. And then the second unused cutscene is for when Dark Meta Knight is defeated, and here we can see all 4 Kirbys having these question marks above their head, and then at the end we can actually see another unused sprite for the Kirbys getting shocked at Dark Meta Knight shattering, and this sprite otherwise isn't ever seen in the rest of the game. It's unclear why the question mark and shocked Kirby graphics ended up getting cut from these cutscenes, and they definitely would have fit in pretty well, I think. Next up, there are actually 2 unused objects, both which end up doing the same thing when re-implemented into the game. Pretty much as soon as the game loads in these objects, it will just reset. Now, this isn't a direct intended effect of the object or anything, but rather a security measure the game has for when certain objects or enemies are spawned in that weren't intended to be. As such, unfortunately, the true functionality of these unused objects, if they even had any, is currently unknown. Then another weird thing that can also be re-implemented in the game is an unused state for Kirby. As you can clearly see, in this unused state, Kirby's graphics get messed up, and during certain frames such as running, his sprites will default to a shadow of something else, like other abilities or several other mid-bosses. Additionally, if you pause the game with this unused state re-enabled, the pause screen won't have any info on it. And you might have also noticed this ability icon of Kirby looking hella comfy. This icon actually corresponds with the wait ability text that gets added during gameplay with this unused state re-enabled. As such, it's very likely that this unused state is actually an unfinished version of the wait state. Now, if you didn't know, the wait state actually appears in the Kirby game that was released just before this one, Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland. And there, this state is used when a player dies during a multiplayer session in the game and has to wait to respawn. So yeah, it's very likely that this unused state is a leftover from Nightmare in Dreamland, and the same idea was planned for Amazing Mirror, but ultimately, when a Kirby dies during multiplayer in this game, he will respawn almost immediately, rendering the old waiting mechanic now completely useless. And there are plenty more leftover things from Kirby Nightmare and Dreamland, next of which are actually remnants of a copy ability that didn't make the final cut of Amazing Mirror. And despite having leftover developer text for it, as well as even having sound effects from it heard in the game's sound player in the collection room, the high jump ability seen in Nightmare and Dreamland was ultimately scrapped from this game. Interestingly, none of the other copy abilities that didn't make it from Nightmare and Dreamland, like Ball or Freeze, have leftovers like this. So it does look like there were at least some additional intentions to include it here in Amazing Mirror. Now let's move on to the graphics side of things, and first take a look at various unused color palettes left over in the game for enemies, Kirby, and more. First up, we have unused coloring for Kirby's inhaling effect, where the unused version appears a bit brighter. The palette for the windows in Peppermint Palace can also be applied to the trees there to show it having a nice purple tree trunk, as well as different and frankly better shading. For enemies, there's a strange, almost completely black color palette meant for Waddle Doo, maybe for some sort of scrapped shadow variant. King Golem has an unused color palette which would have had him looking more yellow and wood-like, I guess compared to how he's ultimately seen. And then similar to the Shadow Waddle Doo, there's another unused color palette for the Jack enemies. This one changes the last 4 color slots to black, and although this doesn't affect the Jacks themselves, when this color palette is applied, it will actually end up changing their star attacks from their usual yellow to a pretty cool looking dark star. The Heave-Ho blocks also have an unused version of them which use another color palette, making them appear to have more brown rock-like coloring instead of just gray. And finally, of course, there are some unused color palettes for Kirby himself, but these changes are quite a bit more subtle. We can see stuff like Bomb Kirby's hat appearing more of an aquamarine color, his beam hat appearing slightly darker. Fire Kirby's color palette from Nightmare and Dreamland is left over here, where it used to have a green gem on the crown and the flame burning was lighter. And then there are some really subtle changes that are incredibly hard to notice, like Wheel Kirby's hat being slightly darker in the unused palette, UFO Kirby having a tiny bit less pinkish gray, a literal pixel being lighter on his foot as part of the throw ability, and then for Fighter Kirby, it's really hard to tell unless you look pretty closely and see that the unused palette changes his overall color slightly, and his shoes and blush are also barely different as well. And finally, seemingly a leftover from the pre-release demo version of Amazing Mirror that I covered in my previous video, where unused leftovers of Kirby's Master Sword ability saw him in a green hat, an unused color palette for this ability also remains in the final cut, where the gem in the sword would appear green instead of red, just like it was seen in that prototype build. And now, moving on to full graphics that are left over unused in this game. First up are several early graphics of UI text, including Japanese text of graphics seen on the map screen, as well as some of the early unfinished stage name graphics, such as Mustard Mountain, which honestly kinda even looks like it says Mount Bin. Cabbage Cavern was missing its N at the end, and similarly, Carrot Castle was straight up just missing the S in the middle of castle, so Carrot Cat Tle was all that was there. Then next, as far as enemies and bosses go, we got a set of graphics for Dark Meta Knight for him doing a sideways jab attack, and this is actually another leftover of actual Meta Knight doing this move in Nightmare and Dreamland. We got these unused sprites for the droppy enemies swimming and walking in what looks like an also scrapped variant of them, where they would have appeared underwater donning these goggles instead of just appearing on land. There are unused sprites of the mini enemies seemingly jumping and falling, suggesting they were once planned to do more than just run around. There's an unused animation for the Gordo specifically meant for the Kirby Wave Ride minigame. And then there's this unused sprite of Gobbler the Shark here grimacing, seemingly in pain. Then, in addition to the unused question mark and shocked graphics we went over earlier, there's also an unused exclamation mark graphic. There are a total of 3 mirror door frames that go unused, one seemingly made of stone, perhaps meant for Radish Ruins, one that could have been for either Rainbow Root or Cabbage Cavern, as well as this cloudy one with some stars that's likely to have been planned for Candy Constellation. Next, in addition to an unused debug font that we also saw back in the prototype demo version of this game in my previous video, not only is there an unused shadowless version of the font that's seen in the game's end credits, but there's actually an entire graphic that's a copy of the game's credits that uses this shadowless font too. We got unused ladder graphics for both the game's cloudy tutorial starting area as well as for Olive Ocean. Then, in addition to there being a spike that goes unused as part of King Golem's room tile set, there's actually another entirely unused tile set for this same area that contains several things that don't get seen, including part of a door, some debris, and a platform. A mountain-themed tile set that's used in Mustard Mountain and Rainbow Root has this set of crates and barrels that go unused. These angled star formations, seemingly meant for the tutorial starting area, also never go used. There's an unused animation of lava bubbling found in the game's volcano tile set. We got this set of really small placeholder tiles, and then there's also these 3 gray blocks that never go used. The notable thing about the one in the middle here is that it obviously features a hammer icon on it, suggesting that it could have only been breakable with the game's hammer ability. Then for graphics of the Puff Boy himself, we got several more that are leftovers from Kirby Nightmare and Dreamland. Not a big surprise at this point. For starters, there are a few sprites of Kirby getting damaged while riding on a warp star from Nightmare and Dreamland's Air Grind minigame. These could just be a leftover, sure, but it's also been theorized that these may have been planned to actually appear in Amazing Mirror's Wave Ride minigame, and unlike how it is in the final game, Kirby was once planned to actually be able to take damage. And the unused Gordo animations meant for the Wave Ride minigame only seems to support this theory. Additionally, in the Japanese version of Amazing Mirror, there's oddly enough a Spanish sprite sheet where one of the Kirby damaged sprites are overlaid with some lines, as well as the excellent text that's seen when boosting in the minigame respectively. And lastly, an associated graphic that isn't a leftover from Nightmare and Dreamland, there's also this graphic of Kirby on the same warp star, seemingly breaking or falling or something. Then next, we went over the unused color palette for the Master Sword ability, but there are also leftover unused graphic for the green hats too. And surprisingly enough, it's not for all of Kirby's animations, but rather only for the animation of him doing the upwards jab attack. And interestingly enough, there appears to be sprites here for more frames for the animation compared to its final version. Now, another thing I mentioned in my previous video on Amazing Mirror's pre-release stuff, there were a few unused sprites of Kirby looking back, and this was once again a leftover from Nightmare and Dreamland when exiting a door in the hub area. Well, here we got some more of those, including for Parasol Kirby, which just looks like regular Kirby, Throw Kirby, Sword Kirby, Cupid Kirby, and then lacking Kirby himself and just having the crown part. There are also similar graphics for both Fire as well as Burning Kirby. I guess instead of integrating these kinds of crown graphics with Kirby for each ability, they would have just been slapped onto a blank Kirby instead. Anyways, the most interesting one of these is the Cupid ability here, which we also saw in the pre-release demo. Now, Cupid isn't an ability that appears in Nightmare and Dreamland, so either the Cupid ability was once planned to be seen there, or alternatively, this and the rest of these sprites were originally planned to appear in Amazing Mirror 2. Next, we went over the unused Wait ability icon that can be reloaded into the game as part of the unused Kirby state earlier, but there are actually a few more unused ability icons left over too. First, in the Japanese regional release of Amazing Mirror, the Star Rod ability icon can be found with not only Japanese text, but also German too. And these are of course remnants from Nightmare and Dreamland, as the Star Rod doesn't make an appearance here in Amazing Mirror. And then, surprisingly, an icon that isn't just a leftover from Nightmare and Dreamland, there's this unused Kirby icon with an obviously incorrect color palette applied to it, but here's a mock-up of what it might have been supposed to look like. Now, it's unclear what this would have been meant for, and despite having proximity to hurt icons in the game, based on how jolly Kirby looks here and the graphic just having Kirby spelled out, it was probably just a default state or something. And then, although not technically unused, this sprite of Missile Kirby isn't ever normally seen since it's covered up by various graphics during the transformation animation. And speaking of obscured graphics, there are actually a few more of them here too. For starters, only the middle section of the goal game backgrounds are ever seen in gameplay, and as such, many of the stars and shooting star streaks are never normally seen. And then there are numerous basic doors found in Rainbow Root, Carrot Castle, as well as Radish Ruins that are covered up by the mirror doors seen throughout the game. These look similar to how doors were seen in other earlier Kirby games, and it's thought that these were used in earlier development of this game as placeholders, and I guess the developers just forgot to remove these, or simply just figured that no one would really know that they were hidden underneath. Well, we know how, labs. We know. And lastly, for the unused graphics, despite there being quite a lack of placeholder graphics left over in the game here, there is actually one that's equally large, as it is basic looking, and this is a placeholder background graphic with what I can only assume are some mountains here. Now let's pivot a bit and check out the unused audio stuff here in Amazing Mirror. First up, we got, big surprise, several unused sound effects left over from Nightmare in Dreamland. We got it all here, from a ringing alarm clock, a sound heard in Nightmare in Dreamland, and even the prototype demo of this game when Kirby inhales an enemy, a cymbal crash, and more. And then for sound effects that aren't left over and are simply just unused, we have a scraping sound, as well as samples of a chime, piano, and some string instruments playing a simple scale. Then, strangely enough, there are flutes that are disabled in the game's Wave Ride music. When re-enabled, we can hear how they would have come in around halfway through the song, but they don't really sound finished or good, so it's not a shocker that these ended up just being disabled. Then next, there are several unused music tracks left over in the game, and some of them can even still be listened to in the game's sound player. Which I know some of you love to argue that this makes them used, but let's put it this way, they aren't used as they were intended. So anyways, just like we saw with the prototype version, most of these unused tracks are simply variations with slight differences. For example, first up we have an alternate version of Crackety Hack's theme where the bass sounds quite a bit different. There's an alternate version of the forest or nature area track which has some horn sound doubling the bass rhythm. A slightly different version of the Speed Eater's theme with more reverb, as well as a louder marimba compared to its final version. There are alternate versions of both the Ruins area and Castle or Building areas tracks where there is more reverb again. And then there's also an alternate version of Amazing Mirror's boss theme that has a different looping section, as well as some brass instruments that aren't heard in the final version of the theme. Then in addition to all those alternate versions of themes from the game, there's actually one unique theme that goes unused, and this can also still be heard in the game's sound player as track 41. Based on its proximity in the sound player to other sub-games like Speed Eaters, as well as just how it sounds, it's been theorized that this theme might have been originally meant for Amazing Mirror's boss endurance sub-game. And now, for the last stop of this video, there are actually a pair of unused rooms left over in Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. The first of these is an unknown room that when restored with the Radish Ruins tile set, we can see how it could have appeared, and as you can see, this room would have contained 4 maximum tomatoes as well as a pair of 1-ups. It's currently still unclear what the exact nature of this room is, be it a test room or some sort of secret room where each of the 4 Kirbys could heal up and get some extra lives. And then next, there's also a leftover debug room in the game as well. Now, unfortunately, it's nowhere near the quantity or quality that we saw back in my videos on Nightmare in Dreamland or Dreamland 3, as here we only get a simple room with a bunch of dots as well as placeholder yellow tiles for Kirby to walk on. Yeah, that's it. Kind of a feels bad moment, not gonna lie, considering what we saw in the other games, but I guess it only makes me appreciate what was left over in those even more. And I didn't want to spoil this amazing debug room too much earlier, but there's also a whole tile set associated for it that goes unused. And it includes various things, some of which we saw in my earlier Kirby videos with the debug rooms. Now this unused tile set includes unused graphics for slopes, moving platforms, various arrows, tiles that would require Kirby's bomb or other abilities to break, and much more. Additionally, there's also another tile set for this debug room that features the numbers 1 through 32 on a decent range of colors. And then to add to all of this, not only is there a duplicate of the debug room found in a tile set associated with the 5th phase of the final boss fight in a different color palette, but also the tile set of all the debug graphics has a different colored copy found there too. Based on this, it's been theorized that either the debug room's data was copied when developing this room, or perhaps before being turned into the area for the 5th phase of the final boss fight against Dark Mind, the room originally started out as a debug room.